I thought this job was my future, until they humiliated me in front of everyone and fired me like I was nothing. When I first started my job, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It wasn't just any job. It was the one I had worked hard for, the one I had imagined would define my career, my future, and my sense of self-worth. I entered the office on the first day with a heart full of hope, eager to contribute, learn, and grow. At first, everything seemed perfect. I was welcomed by friendly colleagues and encouraging supervisors. Tasks were challenging but fair, and for the first few months, I believed I had found a place where I could thrive. I gave my best, stayed late when necessary, and genuinely tried to be part of the team. I thought dedication, hard work, and loyalty would be valued, but slowly the reality began to shift. Subtle comments, offhand remarks, and whispered jokes started to surface. Colleagues who had seemed friendly became distant, watching me with scrutinizing eyes. Supervisors who had praised my work began questioning my every decision. The subtle undermining grew louder with every passing week. Then came the day it all escalated. A small mistake, nothing significant, and suddenly I was being singled out in a team meeting. My supervisor mocked me in front of everyone, exaggerating the error, making it a spectacle. Laughter followed, and I felt my stomach sink. I tried to explain, to clarify, but every word I spoke was interrupted, dismissed, or turned into another joke. I realized then that this wasn't about the mistake, it was about control, humiliation, and power. After that public incident, the harassment became relentless. Tasks were assigned without clarity, deadlines were impossible, and minor errors were blown out of proportion. My reputation was being systematically destroyed. I watched as colleagues avoided me, fearing association, and as supervisors built a narrative that I was incompetent. The culmination came abruptly. One afternoon, I was called into the HR office. There was no prior warning, no discussion, only a curt explanation that my employment was being terminated due to performance issues, and that it was final. I was stunned. The humiliation of being fired after months of dedication, after sleepless nights and sacrifices, was overwhelming. I left the office that day feeling small, powerless, and betrayed. But amidst the humiliation, something began to stir within me. I realized that this was not the end. They had underestimated me, not knowing that the same determination that had fueled my hard work could now be channeled into reclaiming my life, rebuilding my career, and quietly turning the tables. I started with introspection. I dissected the events, the workplace politics, and the people involved. I took notes on the systems, processes, and mistakes they had overlooked. I observed patterns, how promotions were mishandled, how accountability was avoided, how incompetence was rewarded if wrapped in arrogance. I realized that they were vulnerable. They had built their careers on appearances, on superficial control, and on the fear of others. And now, armed with knowledge, patience, and a plan, I knew that the tables could turn. While the world saw me as humiliated and defeated, I began laying the foundation for my quiet comeback. I started networking, reaching out to contacts I had helped in the past, mentors I had impressed, and even colleagues who had witnessed the injustice but had stayed silent. Every interaction was subtle, calculated, and aimed at creating leverage for a future where I would regain control without stooping to malice or unethical behavior. In the meantime, I also focused on building my skills. I invested in courses, certifications, and experiences that not only improved my professional abilities, but also positioned me to step into roles where my former oppressors had no influence. I transformed humiliation into motivation, turning every sleepless night, every public joke, and every firing into fuel for a stronger, smarter, and more strategic version of myself. By the time weeks turned into months, I was no longer the employee they could mock. I had quietly built a reputation for competence, reliability, and integrity in circles they couldn't touch. Opportunities arose that they could never imagine, and slowly, I started positioning myself in ways that would eventually expose their weaknesses and mismanagement without me needing to fight publicly. The transformation wasn't about revenge in the classic sense. It was about strategy, patience, and leverage. By remaining professional, continuing to excel, and quietly documenting errors and weaknesses, I set the stage for a comeback that was inevitable, and most importantly, undeniable. This section of my story ends with a clear understanding. Humiliation and firing are not final. When faced with public embarrassment and injustice, there is a path forward, a way to rise quietly, strategically, and powerfully. And that path is what prepared me for the next stage, the stage where growth, planning, and opportunity converge into results that speak louder than any insult ever could. They thought firing me would break me, but it only set me on a path they could never see coming. After that day of humiliation and being abruptly fired, I felt a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. I had dedicated years of my life to that company, believing in its vision, in my colleagues, and in the promise of fair treatment. And yet, in a single afternoon, they stripped it all away. But what they failed to understand was that removing me from that office didn't remove my potential, my determination, or my ability to influence outcomes quietly, strategically, and powerfully. The first step was emotional survival. Being fired publicly is more than losing a job. It's a hit to your self-esteem, your confidence, and your perception of security. I went through nights replaying the events, analyzing every word, every gesture, every decision that led to the humiliation. The questions swirled. Why did they do this? What mistakes did I make? Could I have handled it differently? But over time, I realized something crucial. The mistake wasn't mine. The real mistake was theirs, underestimating me, relying on appearances instead of competence, and building careers on fear and arrogance rather than skill and integrity. This realization shifted my focus from despair to strategy. If they were vulnerable, I needed to understand exactly how and why, and how I could use that knowledge to rebuild my life and career. I began documenting everything: the errors they had overlooked, the poor management decisions they had made, the inconsistencies in policies, and the favoritism that allowed mediocrity to thrive. Every detail became data. Every conversation I had overheard, every misstep I noticed, became part of a broader picture. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was preparing for the moment when competence and preparation would outshine parallel to arrogance and mismanagement. I focused on skill building. I didn't want to be reactive. I wanted to be irrefutable. I enrolled in online courses, attended workshops, and polished my professional abilities. I knew that if I wanted to surpass them, I needed leverage that they couldn't ignore, undeniable evidence of skill, knowledge, and value. Each certification, each project completed, became a building block for my quiet comeback. Networking became another essential element of my strategy. I reached out to colleagues I had supported, mentors who had noticed my dedication, and professionals in my industry who respected integrity and results. Through these connections, I slowly started reconstructing a professional reputation independent of the toxic environment I had been forced to leave. I positioned myself as someone reliable, competent, and strategic, a stark contrast to those who had humiliated me. The struggle was not without internal conflict. Part of me wanted immediate justice, immediate recognition of their mistakes. But I understood that public confrontation would risk everything I was building. Instead, I embraced patience. I embraced silence. I embraced observation. I watched as the same people who had humiliated me continued to make mistakes, unaware that their actions were being documented and remembered. During this period, I also rebuilt my confidence. The humiliation had cracked my self-esteem, but I refused to allow it to define me. I celebrated small victories, a completed course, a recommendation from a mentor, a successful project in a new role. Each small success was a reminder that my value had never depended on their approval, and that my career path was mine to shape. Months turned into a year. Slowly, opportunities began to appear. Former clients I had helped reached out. Colleagues from other departments recommended me, and mentors guided me toward positions where my competence would be recognized. The network I had cultivated, combined with the skills I had built, positioned me to not only recover, but to surpass those who had tried to hold me down. The strategy wasn't about confrontation. It was about creating conditions where the consequences of their mismanagement would become obvious to everyone else. Quietly, without malice, I ensured that my performance, my reliability, and my professionalism became visible benchmarks. While they continued to rely on appearances and fear, I relied on tangible results and earned respect. This period of struggle, planning, and execution taught me the value of resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. It showed me that being reactive often leads to short-term satisfaction but long-term failure, whereas being patient, observant, and calculated allows for true, undeniable impact. As months passed, I began to see small signs of the eventual shift. Opportunities arose for me to step into positions where I could influence outcomes, make decisions, and demonstrate competence in ways that were impossible in my previous toxic environment. Each project I led, each success I achieved, quietly reinforced the contrast between my professionalism and their recklessness, and all the while, I never lost my human approach. I avoided gossip, confrontation, or unethical tactics. My goal was never revenge for its own sake. My goal was to rebuild, to grow, and to let results speak louder than words or humiliation ever could. This approach ensured that, when the time came to address their failures, it wouldn't be a spectacle, it would be undeniable truth, visible to anyone who cared to look. By the end of this chapter, I had accomplished something remarkable. I had transformed humiliation into a roadmap for success, betrayal into fuel for strategy, and firing into the foundation for a quiet but inevitable comeback. I had become untouchable not because of aggression, but because of patience, skill, an unwavering commitment to integrity. The stage was now set for the next chapter, the chapter where growth, strategy, and resilience would converge into tangible results, where those who had humiliated me would face the consequences of their own choices, quietly, professionally, and unmistakably. They thought they had won when they fired me, but while they celebrated, I was quietly building the future they would never see coming. The months after being fired were transformative. What had initially felt like the end of my career turned out to be the beginning of a journey I would never have imagined. While they assumed I was defeated, I was quietly reshaping my life, my career, and my reputation. The first step was proving to myself that I could rise. Regardless of the humiliation I endured, I began by taking on small but impactful projects. I leveraged the skills I had honed in my previous role, along with new knowledge gained from online courses, workshops, and networking. Each success, each recognition was not just about professional growth. It was about rebuilding my confidence and reclaiming my identity as a capable, competent professional. Networking became a critical tool. I reached out to former clients, colleagues from different organizations, and mentors who would recognize my potential. I shared insights, collaborated on projects, and slowly began to establish a reputation built not on fear or appearances, like my former supervisors, but on tangible results and reliability. Meanwhile, I observed my former workplace from a distance. From what I could gather, the culture hadn't changed. The same people who had mocked and humiliated me were still making poor decisions, still prioritizing appearances over competence. I made mental notes, quietly documenting the patterns that had initially contributed to my downfall. Every error, every mismanagement, every overlooked detail became part of a larger picture, one that would eventually demonstrate the stark contrast between their performance and mine. As my influence grew in other circles, I started receiving opportunities that allowed me to indirectly impact the company I had left behind. Colleagues who had moved to other teams sought my guidance. Clients I had helped in the past reached out, providing me with leverage in negotiations and collaborations, without ever confronting them directly. I was building a network of professionals who recognized my value, a network that would notice their incompetence when the right moment came. During this period, I also honed my leadership skills. I learned to guide teams, manage projects efficiently, and communicate effectively, all while maintaining professionalism and empathy. I became a model of integrity and capability, a silent force that stood in stark contrast to the toxic behavior I had experienced in my former workplace. The key was subtlety. I didn't boast. I didn't seek revenge through gossip or confrontation. Instead, I let results speak for themselves. Each success I achieved, each project I completed flawlessly, served as proof of my competence and dedication. Meanwhile, those who had humiliated me continued to rely on fear, appearances, and manipulation strategies that could not withstand scrutiny when compared to actual skill and professionalism. Then, opportunities emerged that would become pivotal. Former colleagues who had witnessed the injustice began sharing their own experiences and concerns. They noticed my growth, my competence, and my reliability. Quietly, they started seeking advice, recommendations, and mentorship. The circle of influence I had created was expanding, subtly undermining the credibility of those who had once ridiculed me. At the same time, I had positioned myself in a role where my work indirectly intersected with the operations of my former supervisors. This wasn't coincidence. It was strategic. By excelling in my responsibilities, I highlighted inefficiencies, errors, and oversights in a professional, factual way. I never framed it as revenge. It was about showcasing excellence and integrity, leaving no room for doubt about who was truly competent. The contrast became evident to everyone involved, while my former supervisors continued to prioritize intimidation and mockery. I had built a reputation for reliability, precision, and professionalism. Colleagues, clients, and even higher-ups began noticing the difference. It wasn't public humiliation or confrontation. It was undeniable evidence of who could deliver results and who could not. This quiet rise had a profound psychological effect on my former workplace. Decisions they made began failing, clients complained, projects missed, deadlines, all outcomes that were now visible to the wider network of stakeholders who trusted my work. Those who had humiliated me found themselves questioned, second-guessed, and isolated while I remained above the fray, professional, respected, and unassailable. The satisfaction was subtle but immense. I had turned the tables without anger, without confrontation, and without compromising my own integrity. The real revenge lay in my rise, in the undeniable demonstration that the person they had mocked and fired had grown stronger, smarter, and more influential than they could ever imagine. Even when they attempted damage control, the network and reputation I had quietly built ensured that my former supervisor's failures were visible, while my credibility remained intact. I had transformed humiliation into leverage, betrayal into strategy, and firing into a platform for professional dominance. By the end of this chapter, I had achieved something remarkable, a career rebound that was visible, undeniable, and impactful. Those who had ridiculed me were now facing the consequences of their own poor decisions, not through confrontation, but through the natural outcome of competence, reputation, and professional integrity.